Hello, everyone. This is our second keynote for thematic session of Automata, Cyber Terror, and Technocratic Realities for our 50 Plus Shades of Gothic conference. I have the pleasure today to be here with Anya Heise-von der Lippe. She is an assistant lecturer with the chair of Anglophone Literatures and teaches English literature and culture at the University of Tübingen in Germany. After completing her PhD with a dissertation on monstrous textualities, which will be published by the University of Wales Press in 2021, she has recently started a new research project on romanticism and climate change. Her publications include various chapters and articles on monsters, hypertext, zombies, dystopias, and cyberpunk, as well as the edited collection Posthuman Gothic from 2017, and co-edited collections Literaturwissenschaften in der Krise from 2018 and Kinship and Collective Action in Literature and Culture from 2020. She is one of the series editors of the book series Challenges for the Humanities and co-managing editor of the emerging Global South working papers at the ICGSS Tübingen. So the objective of this thematic session is to explore how the Gothic and the horror have technology and the digital at its center. So you have done some research on the discourse construction of monstrosity, and I want to open this session by exploring how is it that technology has turned into something that we fear. A first noticeable parallel that I can think of with traditional monsters is that just as Dr. Frankenstein created his creature, we've created technology. And in your work, you explore how the monster is perceived as such by virtue of being seen as the other. So in this gaze of society that turns someone or something into the monster. And how do you think that contemporary narratives have come to embody that monster, that other in the technological and the digital? Given our dependency and blind trust on technology, how has it come to be the other and the monster that we fear?
Okay, that's a big question. First of all, thank you for inviting me to talk about these things, which are very close to my heart. So you asked about definitions of the monstrous and how those kind of also tend to extend to technology nowadays. And I would kind of turn one step back and say, so to what purpose do we need to define the other as monstrous? And I would say that happens in processes of human identity construction. So when humans say this is the other, this also kind of creates a sense of we are us, we are the we, that kind of cements our identity as human beings. And then when I say we and our, those are already kind of contested categories in many ways. So we do that, for instance, with the animal, and we see that in Gothic texts around the turn of the 20th century, where Darwinian theory kind of influenced Gothic texts that talk about the animal as other. We have The Island of Dr. Moreau, or The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, Dracula. Those all kind of explore those boundaries between the human and the animal as other. And we have similar things in the, let's say, from the mid 20th century onwards into contemporary time, or even like earlier emergences. If you look at Ian Foster's The Machine Stops, the short story, that's early 20th century, and it already kind of explores this fear of dependency on the machine and what might happen if that machine then doesn't work any longer. But I think that's in that story we still have a very clear sense of the machine and the human being two separate things. So there's dependency obviously on emerging technology, but there's no integration of human and technology. And I think what we see nowadays in late 20th and early 20th century Gothic and horror is a fear of an integration of human and technology, that we have become so dependent on technology that we're actually it's intruding into our bodies. There's no sense of a clear boundary between human and technology any longer. And I think what Gothic and horror texts do is to explore where that might lead us. So this is not just about the integration of human and technology, but it's also about the horror, obviously, of what that might mean if the Gothic or if technology kind of intrudes into the human body, and what we might become if that happens. So I think there's a sense of horror that doesn't stem from the technology itself, but more from what it does to our sense of self as human beings in a way. And I think that's why we have started to also reject technologies as the other in a way. Yeah, I think that would be.
Do you think that in this sense, I'm thinking about what you've mentioned about this self-identification, and I'm trying to compare how we feel about technologies such as robots that are commonly related to this idea of the uncanny valley, because we see us reflected in them through our similarities, but sometimes in horror there's also these machines that are very non-human like in appearance. I'm thinking about classical movies such as 2001 Space Odyssey, but also more recent movies such as Peripheral and Sequence Break. And this seems to move away from this uncanny type of horror. And I'm thinking from this perspective of the horror and the Gothic element, that these fictions where the machine is like completely something non-human, like a computer, for example, do they shy away from this idea of the uncanny, or is the Gothic and the horror present in some other form?
Yeah, I think the uncanny works pretty well as long as we have this the sense that technology is still separate from the human body. So then we can we see Gothic horror embodying the fear of the automaton becoming too like us. That's where we have the uncanny and the uncanny valley. I mean, it goes back to Freud and the article on the uncanny, but obviously it's also the uncanny valley in terms of robotics. When it becomes too like the human, it causes fear or even kind of a sense of disgust in many ways. But the texts you mentioned where technology isn't anything like the human, I think that's more a sense of intrusion and a sense of loss of boundaries that is at stake there. No longer the uncanny. We're no longer afraid that the technology might become too like us, or that we might no longer be able to tell apart a separate human and a separate robot, but it's more a sense of that technology is intruding into the body, that we might be becoming something post-human, something completely different by the integration with technology. So there's an article that is called Monstrous Machinery by a person called Michael Sean Bolton, who tries to define the post-human Gothic, and he differentiates between those texts that are postmodern, where we have a fear of machinery, and the post-human Gothic, where we have a fear of becoming technology in a way, or of the integration of the human with the technology, and that we lose a sense of the self when that happens, that we can no longer tell inside and outside human and technology apart. So I think the uncanny is often kind of still there in let's say texts that are focused more on a kind of traditional creation of horror of the machine. So where you no longer we don't have this sense of becoming machine ourselves. Not every text is kind of at the same level in terms of exploring the post-human Gothic, but where it is about shock effects, we still have a sense of the uncanny, I think. But where it kind of explores the edge of what we might become, we get Gothic horror texts that are about the blurring of those boundaries. And the example that Michael Sean Bolton talks about is House of Leaves, where we get this complete blurring of boundaries between inside and outside, where the house is much bigger on the inside than it is on the outside. It's constantly shifting around. You no longer can tell which level of the text you're on. So this kind of blurring of boundaries is I think, essential to the post-human Gothic that moves away from those fears of the postmodern Gothic.
So this blurring of the limits between the human and the machine that you speak about also makes me think about the direct relationship we sometimes establish with the machines in these fictions. I mean, it's common for cyber horror and sci-fi narratives, those that deal with automata, to deal with sexuality and sexual relationships and direct forms of attraction from these machines. So sometimes it is the machine that looks for this relationship, when other times it is the human owner who imposes that relationship on the machine or on the robot. So we can find narratives where the sexual encounter is desired, or maybe a de facto established relationship, and other times is forced, or is a struggle between the human and the machine that tries to liberate itself. The representation of this sexuality, however, is rarely beneficial, or it's rarely portrayed as something good. So either it's the machine, it's suppressed, or and we as audiences, we often sing men who establish this relationship with female robots as the weirdos, so to speak. Like, we know that's kind of something wrong there. So is it a form where the Gothic surfaces? Is it a necessity within the logic of the Gothic narrative for this connection to become a threat, or something that we find uncanny again, I guess? And is this physical otherness that we confront in the machine a form of abjection, maybe?
So I would say the question is from whose perspective are we seeing those narratives, and it's often, I think, in a sense, a way of trying to explore what becomes of kind of a heteronormative model of sexuality. If you have like a male creator, then kind of enforcing their will onto a female robot, that's very, I think, to a certain viewer that may even be like interesting or titillating, or kind of a story that they might like to explore. But for me, it's often kind of very cringeworthy, and I'm not sure if this is kind of in the narrative, or if this is something that I, as a viewer, bring to that story. Overall, I think it also this kind of story often is about the questioning of certain boundaries, and the question of what happens to things that we take for granted in terms of what human nature is. So how do humans reproduce? What happens if humans try to reproduce with something that doesn't do reproduction in the same manner that humanity does? So how do we think through those things? And I think that's what this text try to do from various perspectives. So it might be a very heteronormative perspective that then looks at how uncanny it is to imagine a coupling with a robotic other, or it may be a text that looks at this in terms of let's say more interesting explorations of new ways of relating to each other, like forms of kinship, for instance. There's what's the song called? It's a video by Björk, All Is Full of Love. So it's a visually very interesting video about two robots who are kind of well, I guess I would say performing sex acts, but it's not very clear what they're doing. But it's very much about making love in a way, but it's between two machines. So it kind of explores something that, from a certain perspective, might look very uncanny, but it also is a very interesting way of raising that question. Do we find that, as humans, do we find that interesting? Do we find that, is that even a performance of love? What is going on there? So I think what some Gothic texts do is also, I mean, the Björk video is obviously not Gothic, or maybe we can read it as Gothic, but it's more about the post-humanist becomings, I would say. But Gothic and horror texts often kind of like to play around with those ideas as well, either in a manner that is supposed to create horror or in a manner that is supposed to explore those possibilities, I would say.
Yeah, that's very interesting. I really like the Björk example. So thinking about this also from the perspective of the machine. So the Gothic fiction formats often are a format through which marginalized voices emerge. So the genre has been often interpreted as a space for those without a voice to acquire one. And this is interesting to me regarding the object of this thematic session, due to the fear of autonomous or technology as a whole acquiring self-awareness and maybe rebelling against their owners or oppressors that they find in the humans. So do you agree that this is a way in which the Gothic is present in this technology, automata, cyber horror narratives? And is it there? Are they the voiceless that want to acquire a voice? And what are those voices emerging in what form? And if is it also a way of us losing our own voice?
In a way, yes, and in a way, no. So let me try to unpack that. So first of all, if we go back to Frankenstein, for instance, which I would read as a kind of proto cyber Gothic text, it's all there. Kind of the monster embodies a hybrid creature between animal, human, and also kind of a sense of technology coming in there in the act of creation. We have this very interesting construction of narrative perspectives where the monster is also allowed to speak. So in a sense, it does exactly that, voicing the voiceless. And we have this shift in perspective where the narrative perspective shifts from Victor Frankenstein. We've seen the monster from the outside as the devil, a demon, and suddenly it shifts, and we also get to understand the motivations of the monstrous creature, which is very eloquent. And all of the, or most of the adaptations take this away. So in early Gothic texts, we already get this sense that the Gothic kind of creates a possibility to voice people who've had no voice, marginalized people. Also, the monster is kind of shown as incredibly adaptable, and while it's very, very kind of artificial in its creation, it's also a very kind of natural perspective in many ways, right? It's a very sustainable creature in a way. So even if it's a murderer, it's also a very interesting creature in terms of voicing marginalized perspectives. In a sense, the Gothic offers a platform for people to explore this kind of marginalized perspective, but not all Gothic texts do that. So we have a lot of Gothic texts that kind of are very much focused on reinforcing order, reinforcing hierarchies at the end of the text. So while they explore all kinds of horrors throughout the text, they will go back to, no, this is the structure the universe should go in, and this is the conclusion that we offer in the end. And in a way, Frankenstein also kind of does that by resolving the plot through death in the end. However, I would say there are texts that take that further, and one of them is a Frankenstein adaptation by Victor Lavalle, a graphic novel called Destroyer, which picks up on this Frankenstein narrative, but also combines it with an exploration of anti-Blackness and police violence against Black people in the US. So it takes up this idea of the monster being able to voice otherness. It's also very much about technology. I don't want to talk too much kind of about the plot. It's fascinating. You absolutely all need to read it. But the main character is this Black boy who's also a cyborg, who's also kind of zombified because he's dead. So it's a very other perspective in many ways. And what the graphic novel does is exactly give marginalized voices a space and use this idea of technology to to explore how it could create a narrative of resistance against this very standardized narrative of how societies work and who's kind of left out of those constructions. And to maybe bring this back to post-humanist theory as well, this is also where Donna Haraway goes with the figure of the cyborg and the idea of kind of all of these mergings of the organic and the technological, that they could also be read as a form of liberation. I mean, it's an ironic myth, obviously, and she toys around with those ideas, and it's maybe not the kind of utopia that one that we have achieved, or that could actually be achieved, but it's good that those ideas are out there, and some Gothic texts at least play around with those ideas and create a space for those to be explored a bit more. I'm not sure about sound because there's some thunderstorm going on right behind me right now.
Very Gothic.
Yeah, very much so. A rainy night of November, but taking part in March. Okay. So to come back to your question of voicing otherness, I would say Gothic texts can do that, but not all Gothic texts try to do that. It depends on the perspective people are working from. Yeah.
So in terms of this idea of the organic and how the Gothic emerged through a contrast with its precedent Romanticism, is there a place of cyber terror where it's the resistance to this other monster can be situated in nature, maybe through the calmness or slowness of nature as opposed to the fast-paced, aggressive, menacing idea and aspects of technology?
In a way, again, kind of yes and no. I would, I mean, if you look at Frankenstein again, which is kind of my basic text for many of these things, you get a sense that nature is this very, restful place. Whenever Victor Frankenstein is kind of disturbed by anything, and mostly, I mean, he creates those disturbances himself, obviously, but whenever he's kind of emotionally upset, he will go on a hike in the mountains, look at the nature, and then that calms him, and that kind of, takes him back to his own sense of humanity in a way. So we get similar glimpses of nature being restorative in many of the texts that are kind of based in this romantic sense of nature as sort of this idyllic and positive place. But in the same way, Frankenstein also blurs the boundaries between nature and culture, even in the very creation of the monster. So it draws attention to the fact that those boundaries between the human and the natural world are very much artificial boundaries. So what the Gothic often does by undermining these boundaries is also break up this sense that nature is this completely separate place. So when we talk about the boundaries between the human and technology breaking up, we also, on the other end, talk about the boundaries between the human and the animal, the human and nature breaking up. So often in the same text, we get a sense of a blurring between technology, nature, and the human. So in that sense, it's no longer a refuge, but it's something that can also become very threatening. If you look at Annihilation, for instance, I'm talking about the film because of the visuals are very interesting in that film. We get a sense that it's no longer clear where kind of this intrusive technology ends and where nature has become integrated with a sort of very unfamiliar, very alien technology, but still there's a all of these boundaries have been completely annihilated in a way. And if you take that to post-human theory, obviously Donna Haraway also talks about nature culture. So there's no there's no strict distinction between nature and human culture in those theories, nor should there be, because that's very much also a construct that is erected by humans to kind of uphold our dominant position on the planet. And I mean, if you look at climate change, we see where that kind of position gets us, right? So I don't think we, to be very harsh, I don't think we deserve this resting place that nature is for many people. But we should think about how to preserve that. And I think what texts often can do is kind of draw attention to this necessity to think about those things. Yeah.
So you've hinted several times in your answers at this idea of moving toward the technological, or well, the idea of the cyber, and many sci-fi narratives these days and from decades before really are exploring these possibilities of technological advances. And I guess this is something that's somehow present in Annihilation as well. Like how does it take us into the future or farther, in a sense, and other cyborg narratives and medical advances, cryogenization, all of these things. So this could mean that we can find a way of moving beyond the anthropocentric perspective through the cybernetic, which is what Donna Haraway and some other researchers maybe are hinting at, or grounds that they're exploring. So do you think that cyber terror in this sense can be used as a tool to imagine a post-human future? And can we reconcile with the other in the monster and in this way, like getting closer to it?
So in a way, I think what post-human theory already does is kind of question those strict distinctions between subject and object that we've built there, and kind of, you know, point a finger to where those are not helpful in terms of describing realities, because we already, as you said, we're kind of already exploring those technologies. So it's not a question of whether we want to confront them. We're already doing that in many ways. If we look at technologies that we are already using, you don't have to go to cryotechnics, which people are apparently also exploring. But I mean, look at all the day-to-day technology that we're using. It kind of, at least post-human theory says we need new paradigms, because we're already so enmeshed with technology that there's no way we can ignore that. So in a way, what Gothic horror narratives do is kind of explore the flip side of that. They're not necessarily looking at technology as this huge utopian thing where we might, you know, become better post-humans, but I think they look very much at what can go wrong, what might happen if we adopt technologies too quickly, if we adopt the wrong technologies, if we take the wrong pathways. Because I think part of what technology does in contemporary society is kind of it has not a will of its own, but it kind of has a snowball effect, right? We develop something and then we can't stop it at some point. If we look at, I mean, someone sits down and creates a platform where you can rate your fellow female students based on their hotness or their looks, and a few years later that tool influences elections all over the world, and we didn't see that coming, in a way. So what Gothic texts can do, if you look at things like Black Mirror, for instance, is, you know, think technologies into the future and decide whether or point out where this might be going, point out the worst case scenarios that might happen if we pursue those technologies further. So it's more of a kind of compass pointing in all of the bad directions, so that we can presumably think about those things and change our ways and do things differently. It's not necessarily a completely new effect. I mean, if you look at things like James Tiptree's The Girl Who Was Plugged In, it's very early proto cyberpunk, and it already kind of goes in those directions. It says, look, if you create almost human beings and then send them out into the world, avatars kind of steered by other human beings, this is what might happen, and this is what this would do to the people involved. So it's not a completely new idea, but it's, I think, something that is an interesting effect of this kind of Gothic text. And again, I would say it depends on perspective, because there are obviously also Gothic texts that are very much focused on simply the creation of shock effects and horror, and where it's all kind of surface horror. But yeah, for instance, things like Mirror, I would say that those are kind of more theory conscious and more kind of trying to create a dystopian effect where people actually start to think about their use of technology and what this might do to us in a way. So does this create a possibility for a dystopian, for a utopian view of the future? I would say probably not, but maybe it creates a possibility of reflection, and I think that's probably worth more than kind of a strict sense of utopia of you know, all the bright futures that we could have. And I mean, the Gothic is very much a negative aesthetic, so it doesn't explore the shiny and beautiful things that we might have in the future. Really, rather from its start, it kind of tries to point out the fault lines in our Enlightenment rationalism, and our exploration of technology kind of also ties into that, right? We're so enamored with our own minds that sometimes we need the Gothic to show us where the body and the other and things like that come into to clash with this idea of rationalism and the impressive things that human brains can do.
So just to close off a bit before I open the floor to our public to ask some questions, I wanted to ask if you want to add some closing remarks about where you think the cyber Gothic might be going, if it's going to expand, if it's going to continue to serve us to create this dystopian space you were talking about, to reflect on that problems with technology that we have.
Yeah, I think some of the questions you raised today kind of already point in very interesting directions. For instance, to give those explorations more space to explore minority voices, right? If you have creators from various kinds of minorities that engage with those topics, you get I think, very interesting stories, because those are often kind of voices who are aware of all of those problems because they already face them in day-to-day life in contemporary culture. So I think that's one of the spaces that the cyber Gothic could explore further, or is already exploring further. They're very interesting pairings. For instance, there's a horror anthology by an Arctic Gothic writers called Taktumi, and there's a very interesting kind of cyber Gothic Arctic horror story, I would say, if I had to put a genre to it, but it's a mouthful. But that kind of combines those ideas of indigenous horror and kind of very advanced cyborg technology. So and I can't think of the title right now, but it's in a collection called Taktumi, which in the dark in Instituto apparently. So those are kind of spaces where I think there's room for development, and which are also, I think, very interesting to Gothic criticism, because in many ways monsters have become kind of this staple of contemporary culture, where everything is in a way kind of filled with monsters, and monsters have started to lose all of those meanings that they had over the years. So in a sense, if everything is monstrous, there's no space for the monster to be this warning of otherness, or this kind of this harbinger of category crisis that Jeffrey Jerome Cohen talks about, because it's just sort of part of everyday life. So to take the monster or the other, or also the cyborg figure to new spaces and to combine it with other genres, I think is that's probably the place where those things are the most interesting to Gothic criticism right now.
Well, thank you very much for that conversation. And with that, I'm gonna open the floor to the public, so you can raise your hand if you have any questions, and I will call your name and you can come on camera. Okay, so we have a question from Monica.
Hello. Thank you very much, Anya, for your talk, and congratulations on Sexualities. It's going to be published, or it's going to be published very soon, isn't it?
In June.
I think, yeah, I've seen that around the social media. It looks very interesting. Yeah, so I'd like you to, I just wanted to ask you if you could develop a bit more on the topic of kinship, because, well, you've mentioned some things, and I've also seen that you've edited, if I'm not wrong, a volume titled Kinship and Collective Action. And well, that really caught my eye, because I'm very interested in the idea of kinship. I've worked with it, the idea of kinship in the post era, let's call it the post something, because I've studied it in relation to post-colonialism, and at what I do, or some colleagues whose work I find this interesting do, is thinking of kinship as separated from reproduction or linear reproduction in order to transcend notions of racial purity and things like that. And I'm just, I was surprised to see it in a completely, well, maybe not completely different environment, let's say, context. Because talking about the post era, this you've been talking a big deal about post-humanism. So I was just thinking, although you've said some things, how is kinship in its most strict linear terms challenged by technology or by cyber horror? Does cyber horror do something similar to what I've said in post-colonial narratives?
Okay, thanks for the question. Let me say two things first. I've co-edited that volume with 3 colleagues who I'd like to mention briefly, Jero Bauer, Katharina Luther, and Nicole Hirschfelder. The interesting thing about that volume is that we take different approaches to kinship. So it's not just about either the post-human, so the also sociological approaches to kinship in that volume, and it's not just about Gothic or horror. I think I'm the only person in that volume who actually works on Gothic horror. Right. And also the chapter I wrote is not necessarily from a Gothic perspective, but from a dystopian perspective. So it's on The Marrow Thieves by Sherry Dimalin. And what I was interested in is kind of kinship as a form of resistance narrative against a sort of, I mean, it kind of works with what you talked about in terms of post-colonialism. So it's a resistance narrative against white settler colonialism, who's gone so far as to exploit indigenous people, and not just, you know, in the way that white settlers have done that over centuries, but actually exploit their bodies in terms of killing them and using their bone marrow, because they the white people can no longer dream and the indigenous people can still dream. So that's the basic setup. And what I look at in terms of kinship is the question of how the indigenous people in that novel kind of build kinships beyond family relations, also kinship with nature, kinship with other beings in nature, and how kinship is also a form of narrative in a way, because what they do is pass on knowledge through narrative. And that is also something that Native American criticism explores. So this idea of passing on knowledge, not through kind of top-down history, but through learning from narrative that people from your kin group can tell you, but you're not supposed to, just learn that by heart, but you're supposed to understand it and to grow from it in a way. So if we take that to the question of how technology comes into that, I think mostly in dystopian fiction, maybe if you look at more speculative fiction, if you look at Margaret Atwood's Mad Adam trilogy, for instance, Oryx and Crake, where she kind of develops this idea of a highly evolved, or not evolved, but technologically created post-human species, and explores this idea of where they might take kinship, forms of kinship that, I mean, still in that context relies on biological reproduction, but it's changed very much from what we understand human reproduction to be, and how kind of a really sustainable species might explore ideas of kinship with other sustainable species. So the underlying question is obviously, how could kinship help as a tool against what humanism does in terms of propagating hierarchies, propagating sort of family structures that go top down. We have kind of a patriarchal structure in families, and so in a way that that is not necessarily tied to technology, but you can take that to technology via post-humanist theory. So Haraway not only doing the cyborg figure, but also exploring ideas of creating together. So she calls that symbiosis, creating together with other species, becoming together with other species, and by that way creating kind of a new of more sustainable way of existing on the planet. And that's also kind of where kinship comes in, I think. I don't think she's kind of opposed to technology, because the cyborg figure also kind of explores those basic ideas, and might even come into that as a form of solution. I don't know if that answers your question in any way, but I tried to bring those together.
Yeah, I was taking notes, and I'm looking forward to reading your article, because I think it's a positive approach to technology. In if we're talking about kinship, it usually is. So, well, it is very, very interesting. I'll definitely read more about that, because I just only got to a very small side of the whole issue, which is kind of big. So I was just really looking forward to to hearing your answer. It's been very, very interesting. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Do we have another question from Anna?
Yes. I was thinking, as you mentioned, Annihilation, the movie, I really liked it. And I do share your take that the visuals are very interesting. And there's this, I don't know, it really gives you a feeling that nature is blending with some technology, or with something, some uncanny that we cannot quite put our fingers on, and we don't know if it's an alien, if it's something that comes out of a technology indeed, or if it's some alien technology, or if it's something that came out of our planet in some mysterious ways. I mean, it's very, I think they really nailed that sensation of I'm not quite sure what's going on, and it has these colors, very unicorn, beautiful unicorn colors. It's very nice. And so I was wondering, do you think this kind of maybe using the same word that was using Monica, this post something Gothic, this kind of new contemporary use of Gothic modes, do you think it does have new aesthetics? It brings in something new on the visuals. Do you think that it's evolving, this Gothic, it's evolving from what we are mostly used to see in horror and Gothic narratives. Is it evolving somehow? And it's giving us something new to look at in a way.
I would hesitate to call Annihilation a Gothic narrative, although it kind of has so many Gothic elements. And I think that's part of the whole post thing, is that now we also have all kinds of hybrids and blends and kind of texts that borrow from narrative traditions like the Gothic, but also borrow from science fiction, also borrow from other narrative genres in a way. And I think where this new aesthetic comes from is a blend of different genres, where we have science fiction blending with dystopian speculative fiction, blending with an underlying sense of horror or the uncanny that kind of also plays into that. So that's maybe one way of answering it. And the other would be that the Gothic is very, very adaptable. From the beginning, it's very adaptable. I mean, we're not looking at the same kind of Gothic that we have in the late 1800s with Walpole and Radcliffe and Monk Lewis. I mean, where we have like medieval castles and crumbling architecture and the Virgin in distress. We've moved far beyond that, I think, in terms of aesthetics. Even Mary Shelley has moved beyond that already in 1818. So I think what the Gothic does is kind of adapt to new threats, to new fears, to new cultural things to engage with and to derive explorations of horror from. So in a way, this new aesthetic is something that comes around again and again and again. And I think often the most interesting Gothic texts are those that kind of also play around with new aesthetics on a narrative level, that also do something completely different with the Gothic text, like House of Leaves kind of plays around with the idea of doing hypertext in a printed book, which is like a super weird idea, but it works as a kind of staging of the Gothic also on a meta-narrative level. It's not just a story about the Gothic, but it's a Gothic, monstrous text in itself. And maybe that's also a way of looking at what happens with the aesthetics in films like Annihilation, which again, I'm not fully sure that I would call it a Gothic text, or just a Gothic
I wouldn't
text.
call it a Gothic narratives per se, but I do think there's a lot of this underlying anxieties, and it's very, very actual. I mean, it's really contemporary, and I think it's one of these cases that we have discussed even in other keynotes, and it's a bit the basis of our conferences, is this pervasiveness of Gothic elements and modes in genres that really are not. You wouldn't really say this series is Gothic or this movie is Gothic, but there is still this anxiety and this kind of way to cope with it in a way, right?
Yeah, maybe also those are the more interesting places for the Gothic to crop up, rather than those, let's say, standardized shock Gothic texts that are really much about Gothic aesthetics. I mean, Jeffrey Weinstock, he talked about Penny Dreadful, which is it's very, very beautiful, but it's kind of no longer kind of explores a critical edge. It just kind of replicates lots of very, very beautiful Gothic aesthetics, which is also something interesting to do, but it's not explorative or critical in terms of being theory conscious or being conscious of changes that are going on in contemporary society. And I think those places where the Gothic kind of pops up in unexpected ways, or in genres where we don't expect Gothic narrative modes, that is maybe where it's also, exploring critical edges.
Maybe a little bit more stimulating to see how it can pop up, as you say, in some places where you wouldn't expect it, really, and with such beautiful visuals. because it's really very nice and kind of color palette that doesn't really feel like a Gothic narrative in the standard mainstream idea that people have of Gothic, really.
Yeah. It's not dark, but it's very uncanny. I mean, we talked about this fear of meeting someone, or the figure of the doppelganger. So being afraid that something that is not you, that is very, very alien, could take over your role in a way. And I mean, that's exactly what we have in Annihilation in a way. So I'd say it's not visually dark, but it's very dark in terms of where it takes the human imagination.
Thank you.
Thanks for the question.
So are there any other questions? Any last minute questions? Well, so if there's no more questions, I'm gonna close here, and I'm gonna ask everyone to come in with their cameras to say face to face, so to speak, a final thank you to Anya for being here with us today. It's been great having you here, and all your comments and answers to our questions have been very illuminating. And so thank you again. And
thank you very much for inviting me. It was great fun.
Thank you.